Thank you everyone for coming to this breakout session featuring Katherine Kersten. My name is Emily DeRotstein and I'm the Executive Director of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton and the Chesterton Schools Network, and it is my great pleasure to introduce a dear friend and colleague, Katherine Kersten. She is also a member of the Board of Directors of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. She serves as well on the board of Chesterton Academy of the Twin Cities. She has just an exceptional background. She's a Senior Policy Fellow for the Center of the American Experiment, which is a leading public policy organization here in Minnesota, and she was the founding director of that center. She served, as many of you may know, for many years as a Metro columnist for the Star Tribune here in Minneapolis, and she wrote the first article on Chesterton Academy back in 2008. She's written on cultural and policy issues for a wide variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Weekly Standard, Christianity Today, Policy Review, and First Things. And she also served as a regular commentator on National Public Radio's All Things Considered over the years. She's appeared on numerous radio and television shows, both nationally and locally. And she has been a guest of commentators including Hugh Hewitt, Dennis Prager, and Laura Ingram. And she was recently featured in a series on Fox News called The Miseducation of America, a new documentary on classical Christian educators, which streamed on Fox Nation. So she is just an exceptional presence here with the Society, and we're so grateful to have her. Thank you so much, Katherine, for being with us today.
Hello everyone, it's such an honor to be with you today, and I think these 3 days have been absolutely outstanding, and I'm just so pleased to be a part of this. Well, as Emily said, I've been an observer of the American education scene for 30 years. I've been a senior fellow at Center of the American Experiment, just down the street here, focusing on education and culture, and writing as a columnist for the Minneapolis Star Tribune. And I know classical education's value through personal experience. I graduated from the University of Notre Dame as a major in a life-changing University of Chicago-inspired Great Books program. I have known Dale Ahlquist since before Chesterton Academy was even a gleam in his eye. So when I learned that he was founding a Chesterton Academy, the first, in 2008, I knew it was indispensable, but the events of the last 15 years have convinced me more than ever of its great, great importance. And this afternoon, I will touch on 3 topics: the troubling moral, mental, and spiritual state of our young people, the way that the American education establishment is contributing to that, and the invaluable alternative that Chesterton Schools and the network are providing. Now, the work of the Chesterton Schools Network teachers and school leaders is very challenging. It takes tremendous energy and effort to launch a school and, of course, to raise the money required to do that. But as an outside observer of many years, I want to assure you, as members of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, that the work these teachers are doing, their vocation really, is absolutely vital to the future flourishing of their students, of their church, their and our church, and of our nation. So why is the Chesterton Schools Network so important? Well, we only need look at the social and cultural environment that our young people, our American young people, are growing up in today. Our young people, as a group, are depressed, they're anxious, they're confused, they are rudderless in appalling numbers. Everywhere we read of what's being called an unprecedented mental health crisis that afflicts them. Let's take just 2 data points from the Centers for Disease Control's 2023 biennial Youth Risk Behavior Survey. The CDC found in this survey that nearly 60% of high school girls reported experiencing persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness in the past year. Feelings so severe that they were unable to carry out their regular activities for at least 2 weeks. In fact, in 2022, nearly 30% of high school girls reported in this survey seriously considering attempting suicide. Now, what explains these alarming numbers? It's not just COVID school closures and the toxic effects of social media. Well, these are most often cited and, of course, contributed. But the trends we see here began decades ago. Consider a report entitled Hardwired to Connect, which was published in 2003. It was produced by the New York-based Institute for American Values, the YMCA, and Dartmouth Medical School. Now, this report makes clear that 20 years ago, the process of decline that concerns us now was already far advanced. In fact, the report points out that according to one study, by the 1980s, U.S. children as a group were reporting more anxiety than did children who were actual psychiatric patients in the 1950s. Hardwired to Connect's authors attributed this progressive decline primarily to children's increasing lack of connection to what they called authoritative communities, the result of family breakdown, atrophy of community institutions like schools and churches that had traditionally provided security, meaning, and purpose in children's lives. But in 2018, NYU social psychologists Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff updated these numbers in their book called The Coddling of the American Mind: How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. The authors found that the levels of anxiety and depression they recorded dwarfed those cited in Hardwired to Connect. For example, Haidt and Lukianoff found that between 2010 and 2018, self-harm rose 189% among girls ages 10 to 14, a figure almost triple that of 6 years before. To explain this, Haidt and Lukianoff focused on adolescents' growing lack of a sense of personal agency, that is, the belief that they can affect their own lives, and the aimlessness and the hopelessness that result from their sense that things just happen to them. Psychologists call this external locus of control. In fact, however, the problem that confronts us today goes much deeper than these two analyses suggest. What explains the angst, the paralysis that afflict our children? What's at the core of it? The answer, I think, is this. Our students are facing a moral and spiritual crisis. They lack a moral vision, a moral vocabulary, and categories of thought. R.J. Snell of the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey, puts it this way. They lack, he says, a sense of, quote, what makes something good, what things add up to a good life, and which good things matter more than others when we are forced to choose between them. Notre Dame psychologist Kristen Smith and his co-authors documented this profound moral emptiness, this lack of a moral horizon in their 2011 study of emerging adults, and it's titled Lost in Transition: The Dark Side of Emerging Adulthood. In researching their book, the authors conducted 230 in-depth interviews with a broad cross-section of young people ages 18 to 23. They found that 34 of their interviewees, quote, said that they simply did not know what makes anything morally right or wrong. They had no idea about the basis of morality, close quote. The authors observed that many of these, quote, stumped interviewees could not even understand our questions on this point. No matter how many different ways we posed them, our very questions about morality's sources did not or could not make sense to them, end of quote. The young interviewees replied to their question, by saying things like, I just don't understand, like, what do you mean? Or, I'm not really sure what you're saying. Well, whose fault is this? It's the fault of adults, of course. The blame extends far beyond people like Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, or Evan Spiegel, the founder of Snapchat, and the usual culprits we hear so much about in the social media world of Instagram and TikTok and the like. R.J. Snell illustrates this point with an anecdote. And here's what he says. One student told me she struggled to understand the questions about life's purpose I asked because her parents, schools, doctors, and therapists had given her ample means not to wrestle with the existential drama of being a free moral agent. She not only didn't know what to do, but she had been trained not to understand the question. So let's push the question back another level. What afflicts the adults in these students' lives? Most contemporary adults, in particular cultural influencers and opinion makers, are strongly influenced by secular materialism. They believe that there is nothing beyond the physical world, the world of science. And science, of course, offers no guideposts for a moral life. The result? Well, as Mark Lilla of Columbia University has pointed out, quote, our polity, having lost its way, all but forces individuals to live like elementary particles spread out in space, each rotating at its own speed and following its own trajectory. Now, adolescents who live like isolated elementary particles, who never receive a moral education, are the constant victims of their own unpredictable, unregulated emotions. For moral education is, after all, an education of the emotions, designed to help a human being achieve self-mastery, to form character, and to encourage virtue. Interestingly and paradoxically, I think, those who never receive a moral education tend to what's called misology, a hatred of argument, reason, and enlightenment, as Snell points out. And he says, while some of these young people devote themselves to a kind of techne, skill, others give themselves to an overheated mood of destruction, critique, unmasking, and tearing down. Many, he concludes, have become like the missilogues predicted by Plato in the Republic, who learn just enough to destroy, like puppies pulling and chewing, he says, but not enough to discern the good, true, and beautiful in a responsible way. So, what is the American education establishment doing to assist the lost, confused, and needy young people I just described? Well, too often, many schools, both public and private, are making their situation worse. Let's start with academics. Not long ago, Minnesota students were among the nation's top performers in reading and math. Today, only about half of the children here are at grade level, which isn't a very high bar, in reading and math on state tests. Across the country, 13-year-old scores on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is often called the nation's report card, fell by 9 points in math and 4 points in reading between the 2019-20 and the 2022-23 school years. In In the latest NAEP tests, 8th grade U.S. history test scores hit an all-time low, with only 13% of our students proficient in U.S. history. I would like to point out here, though, that at Catholic schools, which spend much less on average than the $20,000, actually well over $20,000 per student that the Minneapolis schools spend, NAEP scores were not measurably different between those two school years. Now, some of this academic decline was an effect of COVID school closures, but there are longer-term trends at play. So if public schools are not teaching academic fundamentals, what are they teaching? Well, at many schools in Minnesota, I'm told, students can essentially take tests, the same test, as many times as they want to. They're increasingly dependent on technology, and often they are not being held accountable for disorderly or even violent behavior at school. More and more schools are pushing a politicized agenda rather than teaching the academic content that children need to become informed citizens. Increasingly, certainly here in Minnesota, students do not study history except in a skewed, contentious, and selective way that emphasizes America's and the Western world's supposed flaws. Now, I saw this kind of anti-intellectualism at work in 2017, so 7 years ago, while investigating the schools in Edina, the Minneapolis suburb where I live, just a few miles in that direction. Now, for decades, Edina students were the tops in the state. No longer. One student at Edina High School told me that a student teacher had informed his class that, quote, dead white males are boring. In a new English class that was required, and I believe still is, for all sophomores, 4 themes and 4 themes only occupied the entire year. Now, these themes had nothing to do with American or British literature. They were colonization, immigration, social construction of race, class, and gender, and, my favorite, humanity in the face of destruction. Now, hearing this lineup, I thought of a friend's 6th grade son who had asked his mother, why are all the books we have to read so depressing? Actually told her he never wanted to read another book again after his elementary school years. How one-dimensional is this? How impoverishing and how dreary for children. In coming years, though, things in Minnesota public schools are going to get much worse. A few months ago, the Minnesota legislature mandated an extremist ideology called ethnic studies must be embedded in all K-12 state academic standards, meaning in history, civics, English, geography, economics, math, science, and art. Ethnic studies, by the way, is a huge push across the country. It's being mandated to one extent or another in states that include California, Oregon, Washington, Illinois, Rhode Island, and strangely, Indiana. Well, what is ethnic studies? You might say it's critical race theory, which I'm sure you've heard of, on steroids. It has 3 fundamental elements. It teaches students first that their personal identity is a function of their skin color and their sexual orientation. And second, it teaches that social life is a relentless, zero-sum power struggle between oppressor and victim groups. Minnesota's new K-12 social studies standards, which are now in the final stages of rulemaking approval, will, in history class, teach students nothing about the key events and figures of the American Revolution, the Civil War, America's role in World Wars I and II, the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, or the French and Russian revolutions. Instead, emphasis has shifted to ethnic studies' 3rd element, which is, quote, resistance to our nation's fundamental social and political institutions. One of our new social studies standards is entitled Resistance, and it exhorts students to, quote, organize to resist America's systemic and coordinated exercises of power against marginalized, oppressed groups. As noted American historian Wilfred McClay, who has reviewed these new social studies standards, has written, quote, it is hard to exaggerate the destructiveness of what is being attempted in Minnesota. So what I've described here is the opposite, of course, of moral education. It is, in fact, not what we think of as moral education. That is the way to use reason and prudence and first principles to deliberate on complex moral issues. On the contrary, it's a kind of selective moral absolutism, the reflexive bumper sticker world of the, quote, embrace diversity, empower the powerless, love is love, science is real, yard signs in my neighborhood. There's also the new field of ethnomathematics, which is growing in influence around the country. And it teaches that math began in ancient, quote, empires of color, that it was appropriated by the West to oppress BIPOC, that is, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and it should be taught in part through racial and ethnic storytelling. Regarding science, the next generation science standards, which 44 states, including Minnesota, rely on in whole or in part, omit basic tenets of physics and biology. They replace math with a preference for subjective judgment in critical areas, and they devote, quote, an astonishing amount of time to activism, according to an analysis by the National Association of Scholars. Then, of course, there is radical gender ideology. The Minnesota Department of Education, for example, assures our young people that gender dysphoria is a normal part of growing up. Listen to this. This is from the department's 2022 Minnesota Student Survey administered to 9th and 11th graders throughout our state. It asks 15-year-olds to specify if they are, quote, transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid, non-binary, pansexual, trans male or trans female, or questioning. And just 2 months ago, the Minnesota legislature passed a law requiring that both boys and girls' bathrooms in school, grades 4 through 12, must be stocked with menstrual products since, quote, not all menstruators are female. Now, in addition to atrophying academics, there's the growing climate of disrespect and disorder in many schools. In a recent survey, a majority of St. Paul High School teachers and staff report that they feel, quote, unsafe or very unsafe at school because of student violence. Even in some affluent suburban schools, groups of rowdy students now roam the halls while others are in class. And in many schools, cell phone use is completely out of control. Recently, a Minneapolis teacher wrote an op-ed in the Star Tribune saying that she is leaving the profession because of constant student use of cell phones in her classes. There was a response quoted in the paper from a student who said, "We grew up in a generation built on technology. We are codependent on it. It needs to be directly incorporated into our day." So what's the Minneapolis School Board doing? Well, it will vote in August on a policy under which teachers would directly negotiate the norms of cell phone use in their classes with their students. Guess how that will turn out? Well, I suspect you are getting a sense of why the Chesterton School Network is so vitally important. For all the reasons that I've described, parents and students around the country are eagerly embracing classical schools, and the Chesterton Schools Network is helping to lead the way. Harvard historian James Hankins is one of this movement's greatest cheerleaders. And here's what he says. He says, If the sound coming from district public schools is like the slosh of dirty water circling the drain, the sound of classical schools is of fresh springs bubbling up in the mountains. As the old Christian humanists of the Renaissance used to urge, ad fontes, he says, back to the classics, back to the sources of civilization. He goes on, people in the classical education movement don't spend a great deal of time bewailing the condition of schools controlled by teachers' unions. He says they find their joy in rediscovering and reviving the great educational traditions of the past, in the chance to teach moral and intellectual virtues, eloquence, love of country, and the traditional arts and sciences. He goes on. Classical educators know that they are participating in a revolution, in shameless acts of civilizational renewal, and they are plainly experiencing the euphoria of all those who enlist in successful movements. He concludes, there is a certain kid in a toy shop attitude, a sense of astonishment that abandoned centuries-old techniques of learning are just lying about, ready for someone to pick them up and use them. Memorizing poetry, he says, what a great idea. Logic and rhetoric? You mean there are ways to teach people how to think clearly, how to express themselves persuasively? Cool. Close quote. Classical schools are dedicated to giving back to our children the cultural patrimony of which they have been deprived, the great tradition of Western civilization, a storehouse of both questions and answers about how to live a good life. But Chesterton Academy goes a giant step further. It goes back not only to Western civilization's foundation, but to the ultimate source of our vision of the good life for man, the Catholic faith at the heart of Christendom. The goal is to equip students to make decisions, armed not only with the great books, but with the doctrines and sacraments of the Church. The goal, as we all know, is to form not just good men and women, but saints. At Chesterton Academies, students don't just learn about their faith in one class, but across all the academic disciplines. Eric DeMuse, who is the head of school at the Chesterton Academy of Milwaukee, has compared the Chesterton Academy project to that of the priests and religious who founded Catholic schools in our nation's earliest days. This, he says, is a new frontier. He says, we are very careful about the people we put in front of our students. That means that the Chesterton school leaders and teachers teach the Christian transcendentals, truth and beauty and goodness through many channels. Through the liberal arts, they equip students with the mental tools and tools of character to help them to transcend what James Hankins of Harvard calls problematic scientism. He defines that as, quote, the belief that science will solve all your problems, that you can abandon judgment, that you can abandon what the Greeks called phronesis, practical wisdom, which comes through the study of the past and from reading the great works of the past, like Aristotle's Politics, which is about the art of making wise decisions. These teachers teach history, which Hankins calls the teacher of prudence, the road to sanity. They teach it with nuance and with accuracy. They teach math and science in a way that gives students greater access to the majesty of God's creation. And they teach the fine arts, music and drama, in a way that helps students develop a growing sense of mastery, of being part of and responding to a glorious tradition. They teach their students to search out beauty as a condition of a happy life. And here again, I quote Eric DeMuse. He says, art forms us to look closely at the world around us, instilling a habit of attention, attention is the foundation of contemplation, which is why art is so essential to us becoming good Christians. On drama, Eric observes that at Chesterton Academies, he says, students who've never set foot on a stage by junior year may have a lead role in a play. The fruit of acting, he says, will be lifelong comfort in front of an audience and an understanding of how to communicate truth in a performative way. G.K. Chesterton himself said it best. You've all heard this quote, I'm sure. He said, "The one thing that is never taught by any chance in the atmosphere of public schools is this, that there is a whole truth of things, and that in knowing it and speaking it, we are happy." So hats off to the teachers and the school leaders of Chesterton Academies. As the secular materialist vision that dominates American public schools today falters and reveals its inability to satisfy the most fundamental human needs and longings, the students these teachers are helping to form will step forward and help lead our nation ad fontes, back to the sources of civilization and of our salvation. Thank you.
Does anyone have a question? We have one here.
Yes.
At least in Minnesota, what's your sense of the movement towards school choice? We'll stop putting our
What a good
these
question.
filthy education systems and plugging them into Chester.
Well, that is something that our Center for the American Experiment, has been working on since our foundation. It's a difficult challenge here, given let me say that the moment may have come, and we are working very hard to take advantage of it, if it is here, to actually press this with some success. There were some steps toward this 20 years ago or so. We were the first state, I believe, certainly to have charter schools. We have what's called the post-secondary education options, so students here can attend college starting basically in sophomore year at public expense, either public or private. There was a change made by this state legislature that just finished in May, saying that schools that require a statement of faith, in other words, Christian schools for students on campus, can no longer participate in the PSEO. Right? That has already, litigation has already begun over that. We have open enrollment, which means if you can get your child to a school that has space for your child in any other district in the state, that child can attend that school. However, even those kinds of changes are under siege because of the makeup of our current state government. I must say that that the state senate was held in the last session by only one vote on the part of the party who was opposed to these kinds of changes. So they were able, because of lockstep party unity, to push through some of the provisions that I just described. But we are hoping that because the overreach here is so astounding, that there are 65 mandates in the education omnibus bill that passed. And we think that school leaders and teachers are just going to be, school boards will be overwhelmed by these, and that there may be a kind of groundswell that will move us more in the direction of school choice. We have helped to start a group called the Minnesota Parents Alliance, and they are identifying candidates for school boards who will oppose these kinds of things and informing parents of what's happening. So the moment may have come. It certainly happened in Arizona, a number of other states in very heartening ways recently. So that is our hope. Yes.
For new schools, Aptly is catching on all over the place. Is there a minimum number of families or students that need to coalesce around the idea to start a new academy successfully?
Emily would actually be in a better position to answer this. She wanted to know, is there a minimum number of families required in order to start a new Chesterton
I
school?
think critical mass is typically around 10 or 12 students. But we see these youth schools starting often with just a handful of students. I mean, Chesterton Academy of the Twin Cities started with 10 students around a single table.
In 9th and 10th grade only, and then they added.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Emily, now we have how many schools? Is it 40?
So we have 56 schools operating this fall.
This fall. This
and
coming
another
fall, yeah.
14 will open in the fall of 2024. So we are at present supporting 70 schools around the world.
And I was here for part of the Chesterton Schools Network conference, which included teachers and school leaders from all around the country. It was so inspiring. These people are really on fire, and the parents behind them are as well. And you can understand why when you see the kind of contrast that they're confronting. Yes?
I was just going to say, for anybody that's interested in starting, I think there's a definite plan for doing, and you start out with discovery days. And so it's total time about 18 months.
So yeah, if anyone here has an interest in starting, thank you so much. Chesterton Academy School, step one is to go to our website, chestertonschoolsnetwork.org. There's a contact form, and we'll set up an inquiry call with you. But the first real step is to attend, as she said, Discovery Days, which is a 3-day conference in Chicago, second week of February 2024. So we'll open registration on that very soon. Thanks for mentioning that.
And if you have a Chesterton Academy in your city, I would strongly encourage you to go to the gala, go to the annual events where all the students and their supporters come together. And I know here, this is likely true in a number of other schools, there's always a speech by a senior boy and a senior girl. And you cannot imagine how effective and how moving these speeches are. And I know for our last one, am I right, Emily? Both students were talking about how they came from a kind of a despair, right, in their former schools, and how they just blossomed. And also look at the art. Just go visit the schools. Look at the art on the walls. Listen to the choirs. I mean, for the schools who've been around for more than a year or two, it's so exciting to see what ordinary students can do when they are well taught. Yes.
Is it the choir that's singing at mass?
Yeah.
A lot of Chesterton students.
Yeah. And in fact, one of our students, our alums, is sitting right here,
Oh!
Bridget Erickson. Yeah, do you want to say something?
Yeah, why don't you say something?
Your experience.
Yeah, I graduated from Chesterton and Hopkins in 2020. It was a completely transformative experience, changed my life, and really convicted me in the Chesterton method. Set me on fire for philosophy. I went to Ave Maria University down near Naples, but yeah, I love Chesterton Academy so much. So many good friends and teachers who we still keep in touch with. And really good.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
The chair of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton of the board.
Can you speak to what the Chesterton Academy is doing for vocations?
Oh, Emily, you know what?
Yeah, so we don't have statistics yet from all over the country, but here in the Twin Cities, we have an incredible statistic. 1 in every 8 young men who graduate from Chesterton Academy goes on to enter the seminary. And so the fruit is just overwhelming. 18 young couples have met at Chesterton Academy and married. So we have holy matrimony and vocations in the priesthood. And we know that this is happening around the country as well. We're going to be collecting some of that data more systematically this fall. But I think that's one of the the ways that we have been so beautifully supported by diocese after diocese. They see the fruit, and they end up being very supportive.
And Bishop Barron, for example, is a great supporter, Archbishop Corleone in San Francisco. So, yeah, it's very inspiring. Yes?
This is not a counterpoint, but for these great sort of schools to expand in larger proportions numerically to sort of address the problems you've been highlighting, the message needs to get to penetrate to the adults, the parents who were educated in the last, since the 70s, say, so
Very true.
60s, 70s, 80s, where the curriculum did sort of go right up track. So, so many of those people, I think you alluded to being caught up in the sort of materialistic secular, very busy and both parents working. A lot of them don't perceive the treasure that's being offered by Chesterton Schools Network and other city schools. Have you got any thoughts on how to sort of cut through that fog?
I know that's one of the challenges that classical schools, including the K-8 and the high schools have, is that, as you point out, this approach is quite foreign to many parents. Many parents, for example, of kids these ages are just not well educated, for example, in history. And they grew up with a moral relativism, right, as a central formative influence. I just think that things are getting so bad. When you look even at the teaching of reading and the increasing inability of kids across the country to simply to read, you know, it's harder and harder, I think, for parents, especially in an increasingly disordered school climate. Their kids come, we were talking to recently, kids coming home just depressed. And I think parents say something's got to change, and then they talk with friends, and they maybe speak with someone at church, and they begin to hear from the grassroots about these opportunities. But yeah, I mean, we'd like to do a great job in getting the message out as well. Oh yes.
Yeah, I was just curious if you have given any thought to, or actually do for the network, if you run any sort of intra-network activities. So, for example, I was astonished a week or so ago. I read a piece somewhere about how for high school debate, which I was involved in the Jesuit high school a little while ago, that the national organization that sort of runs this project across the country for high school debate has decided that there are certain positions you cannot take.
Right, that's right.
If you argue on behalf of that position, you're deemed a hater.
Right.
Wow. And you automatically lose the competition. Doesn't matter what points you have. You cannot debate certain issues within the framework of this national high school debate structure. Mm-hmm. So given all that, I was just wondering. Before I came here, I was wondering, is it possible for this network to create its own structures?
Absolutely.
So for its own intra-network debate tournaments and speech and all that?
One of the nice things is that every student at Chesterton Academy, the first day of high school, they are sorted into houses. So we have 4 houses, 2 from the east, 2 from the west. And so these students, go to Chesterton and they really form these small communities of houses. Then they go off to seminary, to college, and they meet other kids from Chesterton Academy. Now there are over 2,000 students at least that have graduated from Chesterton Academy. They seek one another out and they have this wonderful friendship around the houses and around the education they experience. There's a great hunger among our current students and alumni to start to gather in the manner that you described. We have sporting events. So we have the ball and lacrosse tournament, which is a Midwest regional, so they're starting to play sports with one another. They meet up at March for Life in Washington, D.C. Just last night, one of our former board members pulled me aside and talked to me about debating. He said, could we bring our young people here and debate and have these debating sessions? I just talked to the wonderful Chesterton Academy alums and said, someday I want you to be here delivering talks. But it's very expensive to fly all these students to a conference. And so I think as we look ahead to the future and we gather more and more of us for the Chesterton conferences, we need to make sure that young people, that our students are with us. And we can use that as a time for them to come together as well.
Good idea. Yes.
With all your statistics, one thing that struck me is, and we live in an age now where obvious mental illness is laudatory.
Absolutely right.
How can you even begin to measure everything when people are actually trying to claim that evil is good?
Yeah, and that we're all victims, right? This valorizing victimhood. This it arises to some extent out of the idea I mentioned earlier that life is portrayed as a relentless struggle between the evil oppressors and the pure as driven snow victims. You want to be a victim, or the whole thing about gender dysphoria, for example, that is now being held up in our schools in Minnesota as a great civil rights statement. You become somebody when you could say, I used to be John and now I'm Jane. That makes you an important person. So it's very hard to work against that. But I think, as Chesterton said, when there is a truth, when we know it and we speak it, we are happy. That's what I've seen at the Chesterton Galas. I've seen a happiness, and I'm sure you would agree. Well, one thing that they do at our school, maybe, I don't know if they do it elsewhere, one of the things you can do for physical education is swing dancing. Mm-hmm. And these kids are amazingly good. There's a kind of a varsity team, right? And they always dance at the galas, and people just love it. These kids are having a ball, and you can't fake that. It's just kind of a symbol of the naturalness of the beauty and joy that they're encountering. Yes.
So trying to solve the problem, you've had so much experience in trying to understand the problem. Can you help us to understand it as the statistics are getting worse for education statistics, and we go in this direction of materialism? Why is this being doubled down? I mean, is there a point where people say, well, maybe we are going the wrong direction here, and kind of come back to it? I mean, I must say I was taken surprised by these last 5 years and how this seems to have accelerated in so many ways. All these different.
Well, I think at the heart of this, there is a nihilism, right? I mean, it's what you saw as the French Revolution spun out of control. Just a desire to break and destroy. Because how can anything good, any flourishing come out of this worldview that is being spread in our schools? I mean, just looking at what is being taught about the United States of America in the Minnesota schools, it's absolute self-hatred. I mean, one reason they don't teach about World War II, anything of importance. Think about D-Day. Think about the great liberation of Europe that the United States and Britain made possible at the most extraordinary sacrifice. But if kids learn about that, then they might feel some pride in America. Maybe it's not as horrible as they've been told, and that can't be allowed. I mean, it's clearly the most extreme people who are driving this, but I think everybody else is just cowed. They're all afraid to speak up because of the names that they might be called. For example, our business community, our civic organizations, our educational groups, nobody has made a peep about the top to bottom change that's going on in the Minnesota schools. I think they're just afraid of being called names. So that's got to change. That we need moral courage there. Yes.
Yeah, I think the best sort of compendium of best practices how to get out of this disaster was given to us by the early Christians. They were entrepreneurs, they were unafraid, they loved community, and they were full of joy. They didn't know what they were doing, they didn't know what they didn't know, and now we have 1.2 billion Catholics in the world. So we just need to, we don't need to invent anything. In fact, that's the whole point. And these people are trying to invent something that deviates from the truth, and that's what they will fail. Now we need to get off our butts and pray and get to work.
Yeah, and I think that at base, all of us want, we want to find home, right? We want to find a place where we belong. And I think so many kids, and James Hankins, the Harvard historian I quoted, says that. He says many young people are poised for a moral revolution. And we need to show them the way home, and they will come. So that's our job.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I actually don't want to forestall further conversation if you want to have it, because I think it's that important. I just want to make an announcement that confessions will start being heard at 3:15, and where they will be is in the back corners of the Minnetonka Ballroom, where all the main events have been. It's a very wide room, and there's screens there with chairs. You can't miss it. And then there will be another priest confessor in the glass front door room where the traveling museum is, down the main hallway there. And then as you turn around that corner, we're going to have 2 more priests available in the rooms on that hallway. So there's 5 priests total who will be hearing confessions. And Rosary, the Rosary will begin in the main room at 3:20. But as I said, if you want, to continue having conversation, by all means have it. And I want to say something on behalf of, sort of my role in the society and this work being important. People ask me sometimes about the Chesterton Schools Network and why we think it's an important facet, and is it really Chestertonian? In 1911, Chesterton wrote, in modern education, the only people who seem to have nothing to do with the education of their children are the parents. In fact, in the modern education system, especially in the cases of the poor, he says, the school teacher does not work for the parent, but against the parent. And he goes on, in place of their Shakespearean laughter, their their heroic virtue, their Shakespearean laughter, their high Homeric reverence for the dead, the poor instead have imposed on them mere pedantic copies of the prejudices of the remote rich. 1911. So this crisis has been going on for a long time. Chesterton was trying to solve it, and so the Chesterton Society is doing our best to solve it as well. Thank you.